Колеги, доброго ранку. Розпочинаємо робочий день і робочий тиждень.
We start our working day in the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. Anatoliy Stelmakh, the spokesperson for the anti-terrorist operation, will be with us on Skype. And now the spokesperson of the Ministry of Defense, Vladyslav Seleznyov. Good morning, dear colleagues. I have to inform you on the following. The Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Lieutenant General Leonid Golopatyuk, in Kiev took part in the ceremony of handing over the certificate for humanitarian help for the armed forces of Ukraine from Slovak Republic. And the Slovak side has handed over to the armed forces of Ukraine a certificate for the sum of €470,000. Today, within the framework of their visit to Ukraine, the delegation of the Ministry of Defense of the United Kingdom, the delegation will meet Colonel General Stepan Poltorak, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine. The British delegation is headed by the Director of the Department of International Security Policy of the Ministry of Defense of UK. The sides will talk on the current military and political situation in Ukraine and the situation and prospects of reform of the defense sector of Ukraine. Also bilateral cooperation in the defense sphere. After this, the Ministry of Defense will see the presentation of major samples of military equipment that was handed over to the armed forces of Ukraine by UK as humanitarian help at the end of the month of January 2015. We invite journalists to this meeting. Accreditation is obligatory, and you can find the information on the official web portal of the Defense Ministry of Ukraine. Besides, this week, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine will meet the Ambassador of Japan, Shigeki Kumi, and the Ambassador of Republic of Korea, So Hyun-hun. Chief of Staff, the Chief Commander of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Colonel General Viktor Mushenko, in Kiev will take part in the ceremony of handing over, transferring authority from Ukraine to Hungary, of the chairmanship in the project of the multinational engineering battalion TISA. A new and modernized equipment and armaments are from state-owned enterprises continue to come to the armed forces of Ukraine. In general, in 2015, according to the state defense contract, the armed forces of Ukraine will receive more than 500 major samples of armaments and military machinery, over 300,000 units of ammunition, and over 3,500 other samples. You can find the information on the site of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Over the last week, the repair and restoration brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine in the zone of anti-terrorist operation have restored 313 vehicles, including 7 T-64 tanks, 3 T-64BM Bulat tanks, 4 anti-tank cannons MTU-12, 2 vehicles of the multiple rocket launch battery Uragan, 6 combat infantry vehicles BMP-1 and 29 BMP-2, 4 APCs BTR-70 and 3 BTR-80, and 4 armored reconnaissance vehicles BRDM-2. Besides, 251 lorries and jeeps lorries were restored to the working condition, including 77 Ural, 68 ZIL, 29 GAZ 66, and so on. So, in general, starting from the beginning of the anti-terrorist operation for the armed forces of Ukraine, 19,975 vehicles and units of armaments was restored and repaired. Out of this number, 18,803 were restored by the repair and restoration teams of military units, and the rest by the specialized teams of state-owned enterprises. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine has completed the restoration and capital repairs on 112 objects for location of military servicemen of the Air Force and Naval Forces of Ukraine redeployed from the temporary occupied territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. For these aims, almost 101 million hryvnia was allocated from the reserve fund of the state budget. At the expense of the reserve fund in 2014, 23 barracks were repaired, 7 heating units, 9 canteens, 10 objects of external engineering networks, 3 buses, 10 headquarters and training buildings, 49 other objects. And the work was done on the objects of 32 military compartments in Odessa, Mykolaiv, Очаків, Kirovograd, Kherson, Dnipropetrovsk, Melitopol, Zhytomyr, Poltava, Brovary, and Vasilkiv garrisons. According to the distribution of expenditure of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine for 2015, 60 million hryvnia is allocated to re-equip the barracks and other buildings as a service dwelling for military personnel. The realization of budget allocations according to the confirmed distribution of money in 2015 will enable us to commission the barracks of improved planning design for 128 beds in Очаків, and also to complete the works on 2 floors of 3 barracks of the aggregate capacity of 268 beds in Starichy Lviv region, Kharkiv, and Novograd-Volhynsky, and also 448 beds in Lviv, Rivne, and Vasilkiv. Besides, seasonal works will be completed in 2 barracks in Kyiv and Mykolaiv, and also other work will start in 2 barracks in Novograd, Volhynsky, and Khmelnytsky. And now I pass the word to the officer of the press center of the headquarters of anti-terrorist operation, Lieutenant Colonel Anatoliy Stelmakh. Good morning. So what was the situation over the last 24 hours in the anti-terrorist operation zone? From the 8th to 9th of February, in the night was relatively calm. In general, there were 13 shellings of our positions. However, maybe for the first time over the last weeks in the Baltsovo and Mariupol sectors, the terrorists have not conducted fire on peaceful residential areas. At the same time, over the last week, we see a sudden activization of the enemy in Luhansk sector. This night, they delivered artillery blows on Трьохізбенка, Новотошківська, Вільхове, Станиця Луганська. In Donetsk sector, the criminals were shelling Petrivske, Tonenki, and Avdiivka. Also, over the last 24 hours, the number of drone flights has grown over Ukrainian positions, and the air reconnaissance was mostly in Luhansk and Mariupol district. Is there any information on Ukrainian losses? Over the last 24 hours, the anti-terrorist operation forces have
Анатолій, я перепрошую, якраз на самому цікавому місці у нас трошки зв'язок перервався.
Sorry, there was a gap in the connection. What about over the last 24 hours, the anti-terrorist operation forces have killed over 200 gunmen and destroyed 15 armored vehicles. In general, the Ukrainian military are successfully repelling the attacks of the terrorists, inflicting heavy losses on them, and the armed forces of Ukraine have not ceded a single meter of the Ukrainian land, and they kept the most of the positions of the terrorists in the zone of fire. As again Vladyslav Seleznyov, over the last 24 hours, the illegal armed formations have shelled the Ukrainian positions over 104 times, and Ukraine has lost 9 military personnel, and 26 Ukrainian military were wounded. Everybody wounded is sent to hospitals where medics work with them. As of today, 495 Ukrainian military are in hospitals, including 23 who are badly wounded. Any questions, colleagues? Yesterday in Donetsk there was an explosion, and the information is that this was the explosion of ammunition that was brought in the 13th so-called humanitarian convoy. Such comments are spread among the residents of Donetsk, and it is about the allegation or assumption that the humanitarian convoy that brought from Russian Federation very high quality meat preserves did explode, and the sound of explosion was heard even in Makiivka. At the moment, I cannot confirm any information that the forces of the anti-terrorist operation have any relation to the explosion on the territory of the ammunition plant in Donetsk. Our position is unequivocal. We do not shell residential areas, but we will try to confirm or rebuff this information during the first half of the day, because we have to remember that our forces are replying to any provocation. So probably closer to the dinner time we will have more information on what's happening on the territory of this plant in Donetsk. Thank you very much. And we will hear more about what's happened in the zone of anti-terrorist operation at 12:30 from Colonel Lysenko.